In the late 1940s, as the British Empire fractured and foreign imperialism retreated, three massive nations were born onto the global stage almost simultaneously. Look at the sheer scale of humanity in these early days. India, Pakistan, and China started from almost the exact same baseline. They faced staggering poverty, overwhelmingly large populations to feed, and the monumental task of building functioning governments entirely from scratch. Yet today, their positions are entirely unalike. Over time, one of these nations has engineered itself into an undeniable global superpower. One teeters heavily on the edge of total state collapse, and the third is a rising economic force, yet still held back by deep internal fractures. But the parity didn't last. While the starting lines were identical, the internal mechanics each nation used to organize its people began to push them in completely different directions. So, how do the foundational decisions made at a country's inception compound over 75 years to create either global dominance or total economic ruin? The leadership in Beijing took a hardline approach almost immediately. They discarded international politeness and ideological debates, focusing their entire bureaucratic weight on realistic, ground-level nation-building. One of their earliest and most critical decisions was linguistic. Rather than imposing English on a vast rural population, they standardized Mandarin. They recognized that forcing citizens to translate their daily thoughts into a foreign language consumes an enormous amount of cognitive bandwidth. By learning, training, and working in their native tongue, everyday citizens acquired technical skills faster. Their manufacturing and technology sectors didn't have to wait for a generation of English speakers to graduate. They could innovate from the ground up immediately. China's standing today is less an accident of history and more the result of a direct calculation. By removing linguistic barriers and doubling its industrial workforce, the state ensured it was utilizing the full capacity of its citizens. Across the Himalayas, a completely different framework took hold. Instead of pragmatic economic planning, this new state was founded almost entirely on religious ideology and the politics of division. The national focus quickly drifted away from building essential infrastructure. Factories, schools, and hospitals took a back seat to endless territorial disputes and localized geopolitical conflict. To sustain those conflicts, the state adopted a strategy of reliance. Rather than fostering indigenous industries or engineering capabilities, they sustained themselves on foreign aid and borrowed military hardware from Western powers. The breaking point for this strategy arrived during the 1971 war.
Even with advanced imported equipment, they faced total systemic collapse. Over 90,000 troops were forced into a massive surrender, proving that borrowed hardware cannot compensate for a lack of internal economic cohesion. Trading self-reliance for foreign backing sets a dangerous precedent. It inevitably hollows out the civilian government, creating a collapsed state where the military owns the country, rather than the country owning the military. Then there is India, a nation that managed to build a resilient democratic structure, yet found itself caught in the middle, burdened by persistent hangovers from its colonial past. One of the most glaring issues was the continued prioritization of the English language. This created an artificial class divide. It alienated the working-class majority, particularly in the northern rural belts, who possessed a strong work ethic but lacked access to elite English medium schools. This flowchart illustrates the cost. Navigating education in a non-native language causes staggering cognitive loss, slowing skill acquisition. The system fractures. A highly resourced infrastructure for the wealthy sits atop an under-resourced public system, trapping grassroots talent at the bottom. Despite these deep internal flaws, a quiet geopolitical awakening is underway. In recent conflicts, like the war between Russia and Ukraine, the government has shown a willingness to bypass Western pressure and pragmatically defend its own energy and strategic interests. Ultimately, the ceiling on this rising power isn't dictated by external enemies. It is limited by imported, colonial-era domestic systems that still suppress the vast majority of its own citizens. This divergence matters because the global order is not a neutral arbiter of fairness. International bodies often reflect the interests of the nations that already hold the most leverage, nations that built their own systems decades ago. We see this in how superpowers manage regional tensions.
Leverage is frequently used to maintain influence through strategic weapon sales or diplomatic pressure, rather than finding a permanent resolution for the nations involved. The takeaway from the last 75 years is that in this landscape, respect is reserved for nations that command their own leverage. Dependency, whether on foreign technology or military aid, creates a vulnerability that international bodies rarely solve. Relying on the strategic approval or the moral frameworks of foreign powers often serves as a delay for a developing nation's own progress. To move forward, a country cannot wait for permission from the established order. To bridge the gap from a rising force to a true superpower, a nation must unapologetically prioritize its absolute national interest over international approval. That requires dismantling the two-tiered systems at home. The wealthy and the working class must have access to the same baseline of education and healthcare, with the freedom to innovate and build in their native languages. True national power cannot be imported. It has to be manufactured on your own soil, by your own workforce, entirely from the ground up. When you look at the last 75 years, the lesson from these three diverging paths is clear. In the 21st century, a nation must either build its own ship or it will inevitably sink in someone else's.